Hi, I'm Morgan Rees, and this is my Ben Talk. I'll be discussing a paper I wrote for the BFS seminar, Race, Class, Gender, and the History of American Healthcare, the nursing school. The assignment was a 15-page paper analyzing a health topic of interest in light of race, class, and gender, and I've condensed my paper on the medical uses of psychedelics for this talk. Recently, publications as diverse as the New York Times and Fox News have published articles about reconsidering psychedelics, the class of drugs which includes ayahuasca, ibogaine, LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin, or mushrooms. Behind this recent publicity lies a secret history in psychiatric research, that of the promise that psychedelics showed as a new treatment paradigm for mental illnesses in the 1950s and 60s. The story of psychedelics' rise and fall in the 20th century and the nature of its contemporary revival relates to the content of the course as it deals with the impact of political concerns deeply related to race, class, and gender on the conception of a substance as either medical or non-medical. Additionally, new research and treatments of psychedelics suffer from lack of representation of minorities and accessibility for less privileged patients. First, this talk will focus on the contemporary revival of psychedelics in research. Then I'll discuss why clinical psychedelic research was discontinued and forgotten after the 50s and 60s. Lastly, I will conclude with a discussion of the issues related to race, class, and gender that plague psychedelic research today. So, recently, psychedelics have undergone a renaissance in the scientific community that you may have heard about. The scientific trend, contrary to the fact that psychedelics are still illegal, is to explore their promise in psychotherapy. Despite popular perception, psilocybin and the other substances in its class actually have low abuse potential and all adverse effects are manageable in clinical settings. Demonstrations of safety and effectiveness have paved the way for many clinical trials for depression, PTSD, and addiction. Most promisingly, as of August 2017, MDMA therapy is an FDA-designated breakthrough therapy, which means that phase 3 trials are underway. I think the most interesting study for me was one about eliminating existential distress in terminal cancer patients, which is really interesting if you check that out. However, as David Nutt, a neuropsychopharmacologist at the Imperial College London, describes, this is not a big scientific step. It's actually been obvious for 40 years these drugs are medicines, but it's a huge step in acceptance. This is an interesting case study of how political factors in the 60s linked to race, class, and gender came to overshadow scientific reasoning in deciding the role of the drugs, psychedelics, in society. Before the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, an estimated 40,000 patients were prescribed some sort of psychedelic therapy and over 1,000 published clinical papers. However, by the 1990s, this entire body of literature was effectively erased, and experts in psychiatry, psychotherapy, and other fields just had no idea about it. As psychedelics made waves among the psychiatric research in the 50s and 60s, unfortunately, its reputation outside of the scientific community warped into that of a dangerous drug of abuse. 1966 was a turning point. The number of articles on LSD in the New York Times jumped from 5 in 1965 to over 500 in 1966. The content of media coverage also veered away from descriptions of research to sensational headlines declaring the dangers of psychedelics. However, as we know from the scientific community, these sensational headlines reveal more about moral panic than the actual danger of the drugs, which we know are fairly safe. So LSD became inextricably linked to the counterculture and its values, and thus the threat the movement posed to the moral order of the day. Given that the members of the counterculture movement were typically white, middle-class, and educated youth, they considered society's future leaders, their radical ideas posed a special threat to the status quo. LSD emerged as a symbol and a catalyst for this threat. The fear of psychedelics and the conviction of the danger they posed, contrary to their medical promise, was really based in fear of the disruptive ideas that this counterculture spread about race, class, and gender. A historian named Erica Dick posits that this moral panic occurred because psychedelics in particular threatened the order of society in a way that other abused drugs did not. For instance, we can take the example of widespread prescription drug abuse by American housewives in the 60s. This epidemic, the mother's little helper, did not threaten the social order, it actually supported it, because the drugs subdued women rather than inspiring them to fight for their political rights. By contrast, young activists' rejection of traditional society, their support for the civil rights movement, rethinking gender roles and sexuality, rejecting the consumerist economy, this was seemed fueled by LSD. They were contrary to the mainstream values of the time in the domains of race, class, and gender. Turning our attention to problems related to these issues in contemporary research, we see that the current field of research underrepresents participants of color among its participants. A 2018 review of psychedelic research from the University of Connecticut argues that this issue not only excludes people of color from the benefits of promising new treatments, a group that is more in need of mental health treatments than others, but it also limits the generalizability of findings. One cause for this issue is ineffective recruitment methods. Most participants are recruited from physicians or mental health clinicians, so since minorities are less likely to be able to afford physicians and less likely to seek mental health care, they're underrepresented. Additionally, most psychedelic therapies are relatively time-intensive. They require several appointments before and after the day-long treatment, so less privileged patients may not have the flexibility financially or in their work to be able to allow it. Another potential cause is fear of stigma. The UConn researchers note that even if the psychedelics are administered in a legal, health-oriented setting, minorities may still feel that they're playing out the stereotype that people of color are drug users and engage in illegal activity. Additionally, the fact that researchers are overwhelmingly white may in turn discourage people of color from enrolling as participants. Because psychedelic therapy involves such vulnerability, minorities might feel reluctant to participate if researchers do not share their life experience, and particularly the impact that race-based trauma might have on their mental health and why they're seeking treatment at all. In addition to excluding a group from a promising new treatment paradigm, the lack of representation of people of color undermines researchers' assessments of the therapy's effectiveness, so it's risky to continue in this direction. We want to make sure that these therapies actually are helpful for all people, not just people with certain types of issues. The University of Connecticut literature does not analyze gender representation in research, but based on my own research, a similar problem exists, potentially linked to stigma associated with drug use amongst women. Female drug users, especially mothers, tend to face greater stigmatization than males when it comes to drug use at all. Psychedelics, in conclusion, may have the potential to dramatically improve the lives of many mental health patients. However, it is imperative that psychedelic therapy is made accessible to people of color and lower socioeconomic classes. The years in the 1960s about changing ideas around race, class, and gender led to the repression of promising research for decades. With the social changes that have happened since then, it's important that these treatments are available to all who have a need for them. One additional risk worth contemplating is the fact that, as exhibited by a lot of the history around psychedelics, that they cannot be dissociated from spirituality. Even many of the clinics that are purely research-oriented include, ceramic mushrooms and spiritual imagery that evokes that side of the drug. And the mystical experiences that they occasion may always evoke the feel of 1960s psychedelic art because those are just what's in our cultural consciousness. Since that genre was produced mainly by white counterculture, it is particularly important that clinical research distance itself from those associations in the design of the therapeutic experience and the language that they use. If the public and the government continue to redeem psychedelics as medical drugs and expand their accessibility, it is possible that the new therapy could lessen the severity of the U.S.'s mental health crisis for all people. Thank you.